Germany, especially West Germany, Germany used to be two countries. West Germany was an important target for evangelism after the war. And it was, a good place for American missionaries to go. There were a lot of American troops that were present there in Germany in a variety of bases, and a lot of the efforts started on American bases. But there was also a lot of humanitarian need in Germany at the time as well, efforts to help alleviate some of the suffering in the post-war period. So it's to kind of connect this again, it's because of the missionary efforts in Germany, or the potential for missionary efforts in Germany, that G.C. Brewer proposed the sponsoring church plan, or the Broadway plan. Is German missions was kind of the predominant focus. The Crescent Hills Church of Christ in Brownsville, Texas, picks some of this up and serves as a sponsoring church for mission work in Italy. But Germany and Italy, of course, they were on the wrong side of World War II, the losing side. And so the Italian people, the German people, needed a lot of help. In fact, the Churches of Christ were the first American religious group to receive a permit from the West German government to send missionaries to Germany after the war. So they kind of get the opportunity to go in first. Missionaries planted churches, they created a boys' home, a Bible college, all of which were created shortly after the war. And again, a lot of these started on American military bases and then spread out to the German population. The independents tried something similar in Germany, but they didn't have as much success as the Churches of Christ. They had more success in Italy, actually. Other places in Europe, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, were largely closed as mission fields while the communists were in power. There were some efforts to send radio broadcasts into Eastern Europe. I talked about Eastern European missions, smuggling Bibles. I mean, you had those kind of things, subversive, silent, and these kind of beginning attempts. But the communist control was pretty significant, and so there wasn't any sort of sizable scale that anybody could do much until the later 20th century, when these communist governments start to fall. And as they lose power, this opens up a variety of countries now. So as the Berlin Wall falls and as the Soviet Union starts to deteriorate, then Poland and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and a variety of other communist countries start, they have their own kind of revolts of people against the communist leaders. And so that really opened up the opportunity for missionaries from a variety of groups, but especially from the Restoration Movement, to go into these countries. Because now evangelism was possible, church planting, and even humanitarian aid. There were groups like TCM International, which had started in Toronto, as well as Eastern European Missions, which provided people with Bibles, with Christian literature. TCM International was also working to provide food and clothing, medicine, right? So there's evangelistic efforts, there's church planting, there's humanitarian need. Others were working to try and reconnect with Christians who had been affiliated with one branch or the other of the Restoration Movement prior to the rise of communism, and so trying to reestablish some of those links. In addition, a variety of schools of biblical studies were created to try and educate people, especially ministers, who could lead in churches, who could also do mission work in other places of a particular country or go to other countries. The last area I want to talk about is Latin America and the Caribbean. The disciples sent the first missionary to Mexico in 1895. Others would go on to join him. They would set up a school, a print shop, a reading room, all in addition, of course, to holding worship services, visiting, those kind of things. The Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century, however, changed a lot of mission work because it prohibited Mexican and foreign churches from owning property. So any churches were banned from holding property, whether they were from Mexico or whether they were from some other country. This led to a lot of governmental corruption as officials were open to receiving bribes and other types of things. Eventually, this position was overturned after Pope John Paul II visited Mexico in 1979. Some of this was a backlash to colonialism. Some of it was, just a general response. And it wasn't something that necessarily the disciples alone faced. Other religious groups faced as well, considering, of course, it changes when Pope John Paul shows up. A lot of the early work by disciples was in northern Mexico, just over the border, but eventually shifted to central Mexico. Part of the reason for the shift was an agreement to work with other denominations about doing mission work in Mexico. And so it was kind of like, we'll take this part, you take this part. And so the disciples are actually assigned central Mexico, which of course is a concern to some of those theological conservatives about these further relationships with other denominations. We mentioned that mission work in Jamaica had started. It was in 1858. It stopped because of the Civil War. Funding dried up, but it was restarted in 1876. When Jamaica became an independent country, when it got its independence from Great Britain, the church too became autonomous, kind of separated itself from the missionaries. After the Spanish-American War in this period, work was started in Puerto Rico. A girls' orphanage was started in 1900. The first church was started in 1901. This church would later have some problems with the United Christian Missionary Society, the Disciples Overseas Ministries, but eventually those were reconciled, right? So there's some conflict here between people in Puerto Rico as well as, the boards and societies in the United States. In fact, by the latter part of the 20th century, disciples missionaries from Puerto Rico were going to other Latin American countries. So there has been some success in training and educating ministers and missionaries from within the population of Puerto Rico. Work in Cuba was started in 1899, but the Cuban Revolution in the 1940s, obviously that ended a lot of the work in Cuba as far as missionary work, and churches were kind of left on their own. In more recent years, because of some of the falls with relationships, there have been some abilities for people to travel to Cuba. Other works by the disciples were started in South America, places like Argentina, British Guiana, toward the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. The Great Depression, 2 world wars also slowed down missionary efforts, even in Latin America. That even though there's not a lot of fighting there, right? That this is kind of one of the places in the world where there's not that much involvement on the soil. It still has an impact on funding and being able to support missionaries. In the post-World War II period, there were a lot of people who go to Latin American countries or to the Caribbean countries who, it seemed like a lot of people who were interested in missions in Latin America. Now, a lot of the people in Latin America were Catholic, but with the independence in the 19th century, those alliances between these countries and the Catholic Church, of course, as we talked about in another session began to be strained, so there was more opportunity for other groups to get in there. Disciples, as we've mentioned before, I know it's same thing over and over again, did a lot of mission work in cooperation, and one group that they worked in cooperation with was Pentecostals. And so this was kind of a little bit of a strange pairing between the disciples and Pentecostals. But Pentecostalism has had some pretty significant success in Latin America. And so a lot of the Latin American Christians who are not Catholic but are Protestant, a lot of them tend to be Pentecostal. A lot of the ecumenical focus was especially true in the 60s and 70s as a variety of human rights abuses happened, as a variety of dictators took over some of these countries. And so the disciples would get involved with these other groups to protest abuses, human rights abuses, to try and protect religious leaders and other people because of some of the efforts that were being made by a variety of these governments. In the later part of the 20th century, the disciples started focusing more on Central America, Nicaragua in 1986, for example. In more recent years, though, the number of missionaries active in the region has declined. Some of that is due to some of the things that the disciples have decided to do. Others of that has been due to a decline in funding. When it comes to the Churches of Christ, there were also numerous efforts in Latin America, but a lot of these efforts were later than the disciples. The disciples kind of started before, as has been the case. Some of the early efforts to Latin Americans were to Spanish-speaking populations in the United States, but then also gradually moving into Mexico and other places as well. The earliest work appears to have been in Texas to Hispanic and Spanish-speaking populations, and then gradually working over the border into northern Mexico. Of course, there had been Spanish Bibles in existence for a while, so there's not necessarily a need to retranslate the Bible, but one important aspect of Churches of Christ mission work, as far as translation goes, was to translate hymns into Spanish. And so that was an important early activity. And the hymn book that was created is actually still pretty popular in a lot of Spanish-speaking congregations. The first lasting work, sizable work, in South America was in Uruguay in 1952. So again, post-World War II period, where the disciples had been in Latin America before World War II. The first convert in Argentina was in 1957. So you see it's kind of starting to spread to other countries. But the work really wasn't well supported by churches in the United States. There's a lot of interest in other places. South America is not as, in those early post-war period, isn't as much of a place of attention for missionary funding. There were other converts and two small churches that were established in Buenos Aires, but there's not a consistent missionary presence. There are several missionaries, and they just kind of get cycled out. There's a lot of names, but then they're kind of gone, and somebody else is coming in. When you look at the history,